Peace be upon you, and welcome to Way Stations. My name is Rehan Khan, and this is the podcast where we discuss what it means to be human in the modern age. I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Dr. Walead Mosaad. Good day, good afternoon to you, Dr. Walead.
Same to you, Rehan. How are you doing? Good to hear from you.
Very well, and we've been on some travels recently, and I guess it feels like we haven't spoken to each other for a little while, but we're kind of getting back together again now.
Yeah, no, I'm very pleased and excited about that. Alhamdulillah.
Very good, very good, excellent. And I guess one of the things about travel, when you get to have the blessing of going to different parts in the world, you meet different people. You have different company. Sometimes, you choose who you meet to. Sometimes you have a choice about who you meet. Sometimes you don't. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today, which is the company that we keep. Now, of course, you can't really choose who your family members are. And sometimes people are very blessed with beautiful members of their family. And other times it's a struggle. There might be people who you just don't get on with, or who can be cantankerous and awkward. And, these are all trials and tribulations that are sent to us. But to some extent, I guess we can choose who our friends are. And so, when it comes to discerning or choosing the company we keep, especially, with our friends, Dr. Waleed, what advice would you give there?
Well, I think I start with there's a famous hadith, khabar, that says that souls, come together. Those that get along with one another, they will find one another. And those that don't get along will kind of retreat from one another. And so I think there is that component of natural affinity and inclination based upon perhaps shared interest. And sometimes even before you know what the interests of the other person are, you feel an affinity towards them just naturally without necessarily even carrying on, a long conversation. And I think that's true. And that's part of that understanding of that khabar, or that report, that hadith, that we will be inclined to those who we're going to be inclined to. And some of the Muslim ulama, they said on the day when God said collectively to us, "Am I not your Lord?" and we all responded affirmatively, that whoever you were kind of joined with or next to during that particular day will be kind of the person you're going to find. So I think it's akin to the idea of soulmates as people understand today, but obviously not just limited to like a male-female, romantic or marital relationship, but even beyond that. So I think that component is definitely there. But I think there's also the component of you look to someone towards their character, towards their ability to remind you of what's important. For a faith-based individual, that would be the ability to remind you of God. For others, maybe the ability to remind you of something bigger than yourself. That saying that they have, that big people talk about ideas and small people talk about people. And so you want, to be engaged with people, I think, that will help you grow as an individual, and grow maybe also beyond just an individual. Maybe, when families come together and those relationships are established. So I think all of that goes into how we choose to spend our relationships and spend our time, and who we spend our time with. And these have, I think, a great effect on us, on our well-being, on our demeanor, on our behavior. The Arabs used to say, be careful who you sit with. Man jalasa janis, yani, the people you sit with, you're going to become like them. Judge a person not by them, but by their friends. So all these sort of things, obviously, I think are important in that regard. But I think in the light of how people live today, where these sort of meaningful relationships, at least anecdotally, they feel are becoming less and less. And we're not forming that many sort of close bonds and relationships with people. So the idea of being choosy may sound a little bit anathema to some, of how we're going to do that when I don't have that many people to choose from. But I think that's part of a broader discussion, or a larger discussion. And I think additionally, people spend so much time not kind of forming these relationships. They spend so much time at work, and outside of the home and outside of what we would call leisure time to order to form these relationships. So I think the work culture and what people do at work also has a very good or a very big impact on how we do that.
Yeah. So can I just ask you something that you said there in terms of that kind of divine history about when we were created and the people we were next to? So in some ways, does that kind of taking the view of like a fictional writer who writes novels, is that then part of almost like your journey in this life where you have to try and find those soulmates? Not you have to, but there is that sort of that, to reconnect with people that you really feel close with. Is that something there?
Well, I think from the divine point of view, all of the way stations or the mileposts that you're going to hit, Allah knows about them, God knows about them, but you don't know about them. So
Yeah.
it is kind of, I think, a path of discovery. I think it was Heidegger that said, pre-modern man says know thyself, and modern man says be thyself.
Right.
So, I would feel more affinity to the former. Like, I need to know myself. I need to, where am I going, and what
Yeah.
are the things that are planned for me? And I'd like to get to them and see what they're all about. And then that includes relationships and the people that you meet and the people that affect your life and influence you and so forth. So I think it's kind of maybe an interesting, fun way to go about things. I mean, at least from my perspective.
Yeah. And I think sometimes it's really interesting because sometimes you will meet someone who you haven't met them before, but immediately you feel some kind of resonance or some kind of connection. And certainly people who are part of a sohbah often encounter that. They feel like, oh, like I've known you for like eons. And it could be the case. And sometimes, I mean, I remember, I think it was 2006, I think, or seven. And I was in a work setting and we were having a meeting with another company. And there's some people from the other organization came to see us in our boardroom, and we were just talking. And at the end, there was one guy in the meeting. I don't know. It just seemed to be to me that there was just something there. I just knew him for somehow. I don't know. And I remember you could see he felt there was some connection as well. And we looked like we were about the same age. Anyway, meeting finishes, we get chit chatting, having a coffee, and so on. And immediately after the meeting, we both went and spoke to each other because I think we both felt there was something there. And lo and behold, it transpires that we were both born on the same day, the 5th of March, 1971. We were born in the same hospital and we were born in the same wing. And quite likely we were on just a few beds apart. So
That's amazing.
it was amazing, but and there was nothing, it was just something so, I just remember just feeling this kind of connection with him somehow. And yeah, it was just, and I was like, oh, wow, something happened there. Like,
Yeah, no, I mean that's fortuitous, and I don't think that's by accident. I think, like we said, these things you kind of you fall into them, you find your way into them, rather than having to feel to actively seek out things, which I think actually, a little bit maybe besides the point, but it does add a lot of stress to people
Mm.
when they feel like I have to go seek out these friends or seek out a spouse or seek out this relationship, and rather than these things will come your way, but maybe there's other things we should be focused on in the meantime.
Yeah, yeah. No, interesting. Okay.
So we were talking about the work culture, and I think you have a lot of experience with that. And I'm interested to see. I mean, it's been a while since I've been kind of in a corporate environment, but I never really thought so much that the people at work were friends in the proper sense. I mean, I guess you can form friendships, but it seems like there's another dynamic that's happening there that's at play, I think, in terms of maybe limitations on forming friendships and how far the relationship can go outside of work and that sort of thing. So I'd be interested to hear your take on that.
Yeah, I think this whole issue about having really close friends at work, yeah, you can have maybe one or two, but probably not too many, because if something happens with your job, then suddenly you've lost your friends network. So you have to be a little bit, be close, be polite, but you probably don't want your best friends to be there. But in terms of the work surrounding itself, so there's a couple of things that come to mind. I remember there was one study done with some tax auditors. Now, these are people who spend like 8 to 10 hours a day looking for errors. So they're looking through tax forms, they're looking for errors. So their brains have become trained and wired to look for mistakes, right? And they're really good at the job because that's what they do. But what this research found was that that behavior of looking for mistakes started to spill over in terms of their work and in terms of their personal relationships. So, for example, when they were doing a performance review with a colleague, then they wouldn't look for the good things. They'd never look for the strengths. They'd always look for the weaknesses of a colleague. Or when they went home, they would always look at the C grade on the report card rather than looking at the A grade on the report card for their child. Or when they went to a restaurant, they'd always complain about the potatoes being undercooked rather than the steak being perfectly cooked. So they were almost like, tuned to look for mistakes. And the same thing with lawyers as well. I think there's a lot of research there from Yale Journal on health policy, looking at how lawyers behave. And once more, lawyers are trained to look for flaws in someone's argument, right? That's what they're trained to do. That's what they're good at. But that can actually start to encroach almost on their personal relationships. And if you look at the high-end white-collar professional workers, lawyers actually have the highest rates of depression amongst all. And you think, well, these people are well educated, well paid, why would that happen? So I think there's definitely something there in terms of our surroundings and the work environment and how that's shaping us. I think the other thing I'd say is that sometimes the people that we're with, we can become blind to certain things. And this is what psychologists call inattentional blindness. Inattentional blindness. And it's probably best conveyed by a really well-known experiment. And I think that people who are psychologists on this podcast, people who are listening, will know this. And it's an experiment that was done where you had two teams playing basketball, and what they were doing, one team was wearing black shirts, the other was wearing white t-shirts, and they were just passing the ball to each other. So it was like a training drill. Now, the people who are going through this experiment, the subjects, they were asked to watch, for example, the white team, and they were asked to count the number of passes that the team made. So that was the task, right? That was the task. That's what they were trained to do. And about 25 seconds into this video that they're watching, okay, so it's a recording they're watching. About 25 seconds into the video, just someone walks through the scene wearing a full body gorilla costume. They walk straight through, right, from right to left, and they're in the screen for about 5 seconds, whilst people are still, passing the ball to each other. Now, afterwards, the viewers of that video were asked, well, how many times did the ball get passed between team to team? And, they kind of got it about right, or 15 times or 20 times or whatever. And then they're asked a follow-up question. Did you see anything unusual in the video? It's like, then if they didn't see anything unusual, did you see anyone in the video apart from the 6 basketball players? And if they still said no, there was asked, did you see the giant gorilla? And 46%, nearly half of the people in the experiment missed the gorilla. They just didn't see it. They just did not see. And afterwards, the experimenter said to them, well, there was a gorilla. And they're like, no, there's no gorilla. And when they watched it again, the recording, they're like, oh yeah, there was a gorilla. So in other words, a lot of them were so focused on counting the passes, right, that their neural filters kind of simply dumped the gorilla into like the spam folder, right, pretty much, right? So this is what psychologists call inattentional blindness, which is our inability to sometimes see the thing that's kind of right in front of us. And sometimes we fail to see the divine majesty that's in front of our eyes. And in the case of going back to what I started by saying, going back to the auditors, their training and their surrounding made them blind to seeing good things, and they could only see faults. So I think there's a couple of things in there in terms of One is definitely the work surrounding can start to affect us personally, like depending on the job you're in, and then also this inattentional kind of blindness as well.
Well, you just said that and made me think of something that I heard a while back, that some of the ulama would tell people who worked in certain professions to not do it continuously. So, like a butcher, for example, and there used to be a custom. I'm not sure if it's an Ottoman Empire or something like that, but that a butcher would only work 6 months and then 6 months off, because during the 6 months he's developing an insensitivity to slaughtering animals, and that might not that carry into human beings, but that sort of insensitivity then would carry over. And they also said مؤدب الأولاد or الأطفال, someone who's a teacher of children, also would have to take periodic breaks, because you're dealing with the child mind, not the adult mind. And I think anyone who's spent any time with a primary school teacher or have as a wife or a husband, they could probably relate to that they kind of frame things in terms of how they would at school, because that's the environment that they're in. So, I mean, I think that's interesting, but the implications, I think, for forming relationships outside of that, talking about the greater frame of making friends at work and so forth, I think it's not easy to kind of compartmentalize and put, this is my work life and this is my home life, and let's put this thing in this box and this thing in the other box. And yeah, I mean, we could spend a lot of time speaking about the complexities of modern life and maybe some of the indignities that we go through because of it. And maybe that's being one of them, that we do feel like we have to section off parts of our life in certain ways. In an ideal situation, our so-called work life would not really be a duality to our home life or to our social life and these sorts of things. But for most people, that's not actually the case. So usually when people come and ask me about things like this, I just tell them, like, it's a necessary thing you have to do. And you just want to apply whatever principles you have everywhere else in your life. You apply them at work, just like you'd apply them at home. You apply them in your social circles, colleagues, friends, so forth, relatives. And live by a high ethical standard, sincerity and compassion for others and empathy and those sorts of things. And I think maybe one can kind of help to get through it by trying to, see how they can actually apply these things and carry them out in different settings. And then you kind of really see, what you're made of. You started the podcast about travel, and there's an interesting look at travel, because the word travel in Arabic it's called safar, which is the same word as al-isfar, which is to unveil or to reveal. And they say that's the case because travel reveals who you are. It reveals your character, because you're a little bit out of your element. You may have travel companions you're spending time with that under normal circumstances, maybe you see them occasionally, and now you're maybe, staying in the same hotel or living in the same room. And it's very difficult to hide things about yourself when you have such close proximity. So it's a unveiling, it's a revealing of who you might be, not just to the other people, but also to yourself, right? Because you're out of your comfort zone, you're out of what you're used to. And so, and inevitably, that's why you find nowadays, a lot of tension in airports and in airplanes and public transport systems, people losing their cool because they're out of their element. And plus there's frustration about things not going their particular way. They missed their flight, or the flight got canceled, or they didn't get the armrest. They got the middle seat. So I think these interactions, however, they are very important, and they do show you kind of, they will reveal to you. I don't want to say who you really are. I don't want to say, if you get mad that someone spilled their tea on you in the economy section of the plane, that you're a horrible person. But I think it does shed some light on kind of, where are you with the, how far can you stretch your character? You can probably do it quite well for the people who are close to you and close proximity to you, especially if you only see them occasionally. But how well do you really know somebody unless you kind of stretch their limits a little bit and see when they are provoked or when they're put in a difficult situation, where that is. And I'm not saying that so we can judge other people, but I'm saying for ourselves, we could see it as a litmus test for ourselves, and take it maybe as a challenge. Okay, I'm going to work now, and I know this person kind of presses my buttons, and this person triggers me, and that person who constantly CCs our supervisor on everything they do, and that irks me. And how do you handle those situations, those little things, those little irritants, but they accumulate. And then when you get home, you have the accumulation of all those little irritants. And then what do you do when you get home?
Yeah.
Does it come out when you're in your home life, or is it something that you can kind of put away and not really get to you, and that sort of thing? So
Yeah.
yeah.
And I think on that one, I think now people are the separation between work and home is almost, it's so diluted that people are actually working from home as well, increasingly. And I think there is a lot of merit to saying that when you leave the office, you leave the office. Well, I remember one company I used to work for, we did some research, especially into the early career professionals. And these were people who were in their early 20s. And when they worked from home, we found that they had higher levels of anxiety because often they couldn't afford a big apartment. They were living in a one-bedroom apartment. Sometimes they were living in a studio. So in other words, they could always see their work laptop and they could always see their work equipment in their personal space. And that created a sense of anxiety. And, what we found with the cohort of young workers who were working in the office, when they left the office and they switched their laptop off, and then when they left the physical confines of the office, the journey home was a decompression. And work is now done. I don't need to do anything until the next day, right? And then you restart. So I think there is some merit in that in terms of, having a separation from work and home. And what is there any kind of particular things you've seen there that you could pull out a bit?
Well, I mean, referring back to what I said earlier, obviously, modern life is not the same as before. I think people, even in the way their homes were set up, um, helped a lot in terms of well-being and taking your well-being into account as a very important factor in where you live, how you live, who you live next to. The Arabs have a saying, "Al-jar qabla ad-dar." You look at the neighbor before you look at the house, in terms of square meters and how big the kitchen is. Those sorts of things that people probably don't put a lot of stock in today, and they care more about the material things. But I think in lieu of that, um, you know, it's important that we, as a people, don't find ourselves in a compromised emotional state, and then that's when we can find ourselves getting very irritated and finding a lot of issues with things and things like that. I think if you're contented on a spiritual level, or let's say even an emotional level, you will be less susceptible to being triggered by certain things, whether it's in your home life or in your work life. So I think on a practical level, I think it's very important for people to have something that they build on their own, or they do on their own, or it could be a hobby, it could be a craft, it could be a project, it could be building a particular skill that kind of provides solace and relief away from the tensions of relationships in general. And I've found this in my life, and it's been very helpful. Yeah, I need to have something that you kind of do that takes you away from the stresses and from the burdens of things like this. And if you think about the Sahaba, they were outdoors a lot. They rode horses. They practiced archery. They cultivated the date plantations. There was this one Sahabi he's mentioned in Bukhari, and he tended to the sheep, and he mentioned to one of the senior Sahaba that I like to be out with my sheep, and I like to pray out here. And he's like, fine, if you're out there and you like to be out there, then call the adhan and call the iqam and pray by yourself. It's fine. So I think those sorts of things that even maybe the modern industry is beginning to look at now in terms of well-being and having these kind of I would maybe they call them like bespoke experiences, like you do on a one-off and you pay thousands of dollars or euros or pounds for it. But I think not in that particular sense, but also on our own to find these sorts of things and things that also, and when I've counseled young men to pull them away from screens and away from things that would get them into trouble, you need to be doing something with your hands. You need to be touching the earth. You need to be outside. You need to have the sunshine on your face when you get up in the morning, and you take a walk outside, and breathe the air and do something physical. And that we're composed of both physical and spiritual and mental and emotional. And if we're not properly addressing each one of those components, then we're going to find an imbalance, I think, in one or the other. And so people who tend to be physically compromised tend to also be emotionally compromised, and vice versa. So they kind of feed off one another. So, to me, the idea of approaching things holistically and not just looking at it as, oh, I have a problem at work. Look at the big picture. What else is going on with your life?
Yeah, yeah. Am I right to say that Imam al-Bukhari was an archer? Like he was a, because I do remember reading he used to do archery every morning, and is that right, or am I?
I don't call that in particular, but it very might have been.
Okay.
I just read today, actually, one of the people who summarized Imam al-Bukhari, his name was Abdullah ibn Abi Jamra, who was originally from Al-Andalus. He was a farmer, and he was, uh, you know, uh, took care of animals and things like this, and he spent a lot of his time doing that. But he was also a scholar, and a copious one at that, and he wrote a lot, and he taught a lot. But he also had this other portion of his life, this other aspect of his life.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
I mean, I was recently traveling, and I was in a country where a friend of mine there, and he's kind of he's a bit younger than me, and he took me to this board game convention. Okay. And it's like it was a huge warehouse. And there were probably men, probably like kind of, in their 40s and 50s. Okay. And all playing board games, like these war games, Battle of Waterloo or something else, some really epic battles, and they literally built all their pieces, their weapons, and everything else. And in every single level of this warehouse, in all the rooms, people were set up playing board games. And I just and my friend said to me, he said to me, if I hadn't become Muslim, I would be here doing this right now. Yeah. But it just struck me that it was something actually just quite wholesome in some way, in the sense that they were here doing something with their hands. It was a social activity. They were, talking, playing with their friends, and they'd built their games. They'd written rules and so on. And yeah, I just felt that, okay, well, they're here and they're not doing something, that could be worse. But it was just quite interesting in the fact that you do need to have some kind of outlet as well. Yeah.
you just made me think of that book. I think you probably read it too, Bowling Alone by Putnam,
Mm.
that talks about the breakdown of American society from a social aspect. And the theory that he puts forth is that these social bonds are formed at more informal settings rather than formal institutions, like the bowling alley. I don't know if people in the UK have bowling alleys, but bowling alleys in America at the height of it was like a thing. Everybody would go on a Friday or Saturday night, and they would get together and have these social bowling leagues. And I remember growing up, even my father took he had like a social tennis league that he would go to in the evenings and sometimes in the mornings on the weekends, and I'd go with him. And they were like a community of themselves, and they were like a group, and and they had social bonds, and they saw each other outside of playing tennis and things like this. And I feel like nowadays we have less and less of that. We don't have these informal settings. Nowadays mothers feel the need to set up play dates, right, on their calendar, and it's because they formalized everything. And so you used to have people come knock on your door, like if they were a neighbor or a friend or a relative, and they just show up and, oh yeah, come in, let's have a coffee. And today that would be unheard of, just to show up and without a WhatsApp message or setting up an appointment or these sorts of things. So I think in the manner that we formalized the way that we can form relationships, the way that we can get together, the way that we can get to know one another, we've actually put up these barriers that have actually made us, for lack of a better word, quite sad. That we don't have an easier access to be able to forge these relationships.
Yeah, exactly. I think we've lost that spontaneity, that sense of serendipity, that things just happen, things that happen. Yeah, I think one thing also just that comes to mind is around sometimes how our family and friends and the environment that we grow up in can actually kind of trigger our behavior. And I remember reading about the case of there was a Hungarian family called a Hungarian family called the Polgar family, and the patriarch Laszlo Polgar, he was grew up in the 1960s, and he had a theory that a genius is not born, but is educated and trained. A genius is not born, but is educated and trained. And his view was that if you have deliberate practice and you have a particular environment for a child, then that child can become a genius in any field, right? So this is more nurture rather than nature. And obviously it's a bit of both, but it's more nurture. And he believed in his conviction so much that he decided to test this theory on his children. So him and his wife, they came up with a plan that they were going to raise their children to become chess prodigies, right? Now, to facilitate this, their children were going to be homeschooled, which was very unusual in Hungary at the time. The house was going to be full of books on chess because there's no computers back then. Obviously, it's the 60s. The house was going to be full of books on chess, pictures of chess players, chess boards everywhere. Now, the couple then had three daughters, Susan, Sophia, and Judith. Now, the oldest one, Susan, she started playing chess as a 4-year-old, and within 6 months, she was defeating adults. The second one, Sophia, she actually became a world champion by 14, and a few years later became a grandmaster. And then the youngest one, Judith, at 12, was the youngest player ever listed in the world's top 100 players. And at 15 and 4 months, she became the youngest grandmaster of all time. So she was even younger than Bobby Fischer, who was the youngest grandmaster. And then for the next 27 years, Judith was the female world chess champion, highest ranking female player. So the sisters, all three sisters, were raised in an environment where chess was given primacy, right? And being obsessed with chess was normal in their world. So I think, for all of us, if we grow up in a family where everyone reads, then reading is going to be normal. That's what everyone does. If you grow up in a family where growing your own food in the garden is normal, well, guess what? You'll think that's normal and you'll do it. And likewise, if you end up working in a office where everyone is obsessed with designer clothes, then it's quite likely it's going to start to affect you as well, or you're going to rebel against it and perhaps go the other way as well. So I think there's kind of a lot to be said around some of the kind of triggers and sort of things around us as well in terms of our family. But I don't know if you've got anything to say about that, particularly around spiritual training and around home environment and
Well, I think the main challenge for Muslim families or faith-based families today is that you want to strike a balance with promoting that sort of environment that's wholesome, that's focused on well-being, that's focused on spirituality and focused on gratitude and those things that we all want to grow up with and have them kind of be part and parcel of who we are, and things that are we don't struggle to engender within ourselves, right? It become more natural because we grew up that way, and that would be ideal. But striking the balance between that and also not living in a manner that would isolate you from the greater society around you. And I think that's where the real struggle comes in. And I've seen the gamut of it in different families. So, some families become quite strict and they don't want their children even wearing anything with some commercial logo on it or something like that, like Spider-Man. And then there are others who kind of don't focus on any of those things and let them have play dates and associate with whoever they're going to associate with. But I think somewhere in the middle, right? And I think what I've tried to do with my family and what I've seen with other families is we're not going to hide anything of what's out there. I mean, eventually at a certain age, they have to be aware that other people live different way, and that's okay. But we choose this way. And when you have people who are supportive in the community, that's why we always emphasize the importance of community. When you have other people in the community who are kind of doing a similar thing, then it doesn't seem like something weird or strange or outside of, because what's the common refrain amongst children? Well, Johnny's parents let him do that, and Johnny's parents let him have an iPhone, and how come I can't have one? And that sort of thing. So, but when you have people around you, and it doesn't have to be that many families, it could be 2, 3, 4 families, and you can pull this off initially, where you can cooperate and collaborate in that way, and to help raise your children in a similar manner. But like I said, eventually they're going to get to a point where they're going to see everything. And I think kind of the old school way of just protect them from all things and let them not encounter it and they'll never see it. One of our teachers a while back, he said, it's kind of like when you get a vaccine and you get inoculated. What is a vaccine except it's part of the disease, but not enough to actually get you sick. So you have to build the antibodies without actually falling into the sickness. So in a sense, we have to immunize our children, which means you do expose them to some degree to know what the rest of the world is doing, rather than they get out and then it becomes a shock to them, and then they have no immunity, and then they can get infected very easily if the metaphor suffices.
So one thing I remember my father used to say to me, he used to say that, one of the best ways to keep out of trouble is to avoid being in the situation in the first place. Right. And then, especially around certain kind of
Makes sense.
people. And I know if you look at the kind of the research in this area, which looks at people who have great ability to resist things, i.e. they have a high level of, resistance to getting distracted or falling into bad habits. What the research shows is that what they're really good at is just avoiding those situations. So if you know that you have a problem with food, and you can't control yourself, then avoid going to the fast food outlets in the shopping mall, and so on and so on. So if you can avoid those environments, and that's definitely gonna help you a little bit there. But one thing then, in terms of family members, to ask you about, which is that how do you deal with maybe like a difficult family member? Because we've been speaking about uh, the people around us and the company we keep, but family is that's we have an obligation. So how do you manage that?
It's a challenge, and I think part of our approach will be who the family member actually is. I mean, if it's someone who's very close proximity, like first degree family member, so obviously like a parent or a child or a spouse, um, then that's going to be more of an intense relationship than say like an uncle or an aunt or a cousin or something like that. So, but all of them are going to be based upon the framework of rights and responsibilities. So these people do have certain rights upon you, and you want to fulfill that responsibility. But at the same time, we don't subject ourselves to undue harm also. So that also is a balance, and we have to reconcile that balance. I do think today that people are too quick to kind of determine that no, this person is toxic and I have to cut them out of my life and I just got to get away from them. Slow down. Let's look at it first if that's really the situation, or are we jumping to a conclusion? And certainly, if it's a spouse or a parent or a child, it's like you can't really cut them out. I mean, they're going to be part of your life. So I think it's more about one, don't personalize everything. What's going on with them may actually not have a lot to do with you at all. But since you are the person in close proximity, then you are suffering the brunt of it. And so you should realize that. Don't take it personally. That may soften the blow a little bit, maybe not. Also, try to empathize with them as much as you can. See what really the core issue is. Sometimes when people act out, it's just that they're actually calling out for help. And they're looking to you for help. It just came out in a way that looked like anger and confrontation, but in actuality, it's they're seeking your help, they're seeking your love, they're seeking for you to be more of their companion. So I think really all of these situations have to do with compassion and mercy. The Prophet ﷺ, at one point in his life, he had several wives, and some of the seerah talks about there would sometimes be a little bit of rivalry between the wives and that sort of thing. And so one of the wives brought to the Prophet ﷺ kind of a jar or a bowl of honey. And Sittina Aisha, one of the beloved wives of the Prophet ﷺ, kind of took that and threw it on the ground. And it broke. So it was all over the place. So you would think in this situation, maybe the Prophet would rebuke her or be stern with her. He said, no, he laughed. He said, غَالَتْ أُمُّكُمْ. Oh, mashallah, your mother, she got a little bit jealous, no big deal. They laughed it off. Right, he kind of brushed it off, right, knowing that what would cause her to act in that particular way, except her deep, profound love for the Prophet ﷺ, and she's not really keen on sharing with anybody. So why would you blame her for that? So looking at things like this. But I think that's much easier said than done, to be in a position to act in this particular calm and, let's say, collected manner when things arise. Like I said earlier, you yourself have to be in a very good place. You yourself have to have a solid relationship with your Lord and with your Deen, and with other people, and then you'll be more in a position to be able to give in this particular way. But if you're already depleted, right, and you're not taking care of yourself, then it's very hard to give to others. So the cliche example of the airplane, and you have to put the mask on yourself first before the child, is true. Yani, you do have to attend. It doesn't mean that you become selfish and look at your needs more important than other needs. No, you're looking at your needs in order so that you may serve other people's needs, is the idea. So you need to be getting enough sleep. You need to be eating properly. You need to have a proper diet. You need to have a regimen of physical fitness. You need to have a regimen of meditation and of social interaction with people who make you feel light and airy and relieve you. Because then when you get into the relationships where it's not so much like that, you kind of have enough petrol in the tank, to see it through. But if you're depleted and your tank is zero, it will be quite difficult to do that.
Interesting, interesting. Yep, yep. Yeah, and I think this whole topic around proximity and conformity is quite interesting because we do tend to sometimes at least like that entrainment effect, right? The people that you're with, you can start to swing like them in terms of the pendulum and their rhythm and so on. And I remember I once worked for an executive who was really very aggressive. I had a good relationship with him, but he was very aggressive, very gung ho, and he used to think that all the competition were enemies and they were going to stab us in the back. And you got to Rehan, you got to throw the first punch. He would say, kick them while they're down. That he was like really that kind of very aggressive. And I for a few months, I found myself the tone of my language started to become more robust and a bit more aggressive to almost like mirror the boss. And then I remember one day thinking to myself, this is not my character. I'm not like this. Why am I doing this? I don't have to be bellicose and aggressive and so on. So yeah, definitely, I think the people around us shape us in that way. I remember there's one study that was done with about 12,000 subjects over about 3 decades, and they found that a person's chances of becoming obese increase by 57% if they have a friend who's become obese as well. So the people around you. And a separate study found that if one person in a relationship loses weight, the other partner is a third of a chance they're going to also lose weight as well. And likewise, there are studies around IQ and the fact that if your best friend's IQ at the age of 11 and 12 is high, then your IQ is actually going to end up higher at the age of 15 as well. So that's why often as parents, you're very like, who's my kid hanging out with? Okay, you want obviously the other child to be nice, to have good character and good behavior. But if truth be told, sometimes we also want our kids to hang out with some of the brighter kids. So some of it rubs off on them as well. So I think that's something really to sort of to think about. And I guess one way to really articulate that is if you're in a situation where the proximity to someone is causing you difficulty, is to think about what kind of character do you want to become, or what sort of person do I want to be? To really think about that, to reflect on that. And often we don't really reflect very deeply on these kind of questions about what kind of person do I want to be. And once you have some clarity on that, whether it's okay, I need to be more generous or magnanimous or charitable or or whatever it might be, is then I guess to find people who are like that and then to spend time with them. Because when you join that type of group, your proximity to them will enable you to come to the realization that you have a long way to go, right? Where you have a long way to go. And I think there's, I mean, I'm sure you can tell me there's probably, I think, several aphorisms in the Hikam of Ibn Atiyallah al-Iskandari, which probably, talk to that as well. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting you say that, because most of the ulama, they kind of asserted a spiritual hierarchy And Imam Sharani, one of the books I'll talk about when we talk about recommending books, he says that if you are having companionship with someone who is, let's say, a role of a mentor or a sheikh, or like, let's say you deem them to be spiritually superior to you, it's not really a sohbah. It's not, because sohbah is with your peers. That would be like when we talk formally about sohbah and the rights of sohbah and friendship and so forth. But if you're someone like that, then it's more about benefiting from them and serving them, and that would be the framework of the sohbah that you have with them. So someone like a teacher, a mentor, a sheikh, something like this, then you would benefiting from them because they have a lot that they can impart upon you, and not just their words, but also their states, the way they do things. And for me, to be honest, I'm very, very grateful that I had the opportunity to have sohbah with a lot of these types of people, and I wouldn't be the tenth of the person I am if I didn't have their companionship. And just not even just studying with them, but having walking with them, seeing what they do when they get to the house, when they grab something for public transportation, how they do that, how they talk to people, how they conduct themselves in an airport, how they talk to the airline staff, and things like this. And we take those sort of things for granted, but um, you know, I think everyone needs to have some sort of figure in their life who they can look up to in order to benefit in that way. And then when you do benefit from such a person, then you in the future will be such a person also, because you'll carry it on. And this is kind of one of the meanings of Sanad. And if you look at for example, the Sufi tariqas, their Sanad is primarily based upon this sort of relationship. So it's not based upon the reading of text, but it's based upon sohbah. That this person, literally they say, Fulan akhadha an Fulan, or akhadha min Fulan. This person took from this person. What did they take? A book? No, they took their companionship, and in turn, they took their character. So this idea of conformity is very much, I think, a part of how we see it in the Islamic ethos. That be careful who you spend your time with, and try to spend your time with people who are actually going to rub off on you in a very positive way. And then these same manuals will tell you, beware of people who are of the ahdath, which means the spiritually immature. So someone who's hadith means someone who's very young, but in this context, it means not necessarily have to be young. They could be 60 years old, but if they're spiritually immature, then that's someone that you're not going to benefit from. And then the only people who would actually spend time with such people would be those who are in the mentor sheikh thing. Because if you're that sort of person, then you can spend time with anybody, and literally you won't be the one affected, you will affect others. And so I think you have to be able to judge yourself. Am I the one who's going to affect others, or am I going to be affected by others, depending upon that sort of relationship? And like you said, if you go to the food court and you have a problem with food, and so you want to take yourself out of that situation. But some people can walk by the food court 5, 6 times and not affected because that's not where they're at. So I think everyone has to judge themselves and make that assessment.
Yeah, exactly. And I think conformity is definitely one of those things where either we feel that we are compelled to go along with the group, or we have enough resistance to to withhold that. I remember when I was many years ago, early 90s, I was at university, and I had the opportunity to go to the US at the time, and with a friend of mine who actually got ill when we got there. And I had a few friends from some really kind of US friends who were from very deprived kind of community, and I hung out with them for like 2 weeks, and you could really see everyone in that environment. I won't say where in America it was, but everyone in that particular downtown city was really just living for Saturday night. That's all they were doing. They were just getting through the week. It was a toil. It was difficult. The infrastructure was dilapidated, falling apart, and they were all just aiming for Saturday night. That was it. And that was the group conformity, right? And then when you started speaking to them about other topics, for a lot of these people, it was initially jarring, but then when you start talking about history or African American history, or characters like Medgar Evers and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and many other great African Americans, it was suddenly like, oh, I didn't know this. Like, what is this? This is so interesting. So you almost like bring them out of that environment they were sort of conforming to, and you start to introduce a different paradigm, a different discussion, and so on. But maybe we can save that for a different time, as I feel like we're kind of like probably getting towards the end of the program. Is there any kind of like last comments before I ask you for a book or that you'd like to recommend? Anything else that you'd like to uh, uh, round up on?
Well, I just think we live in very complex environments now, and we probably feel often that we don't have a lot of control over how and why we do things or who we're with and that sort of thing. So I think it's okay to embrace that and acknowledge that and say, okay, these are the things I don't have a lot of influence to work over, and then just see as, again, as quoting Imam Sharani, anyone that you encounter, try to leave them in a better state than when they first encountered you, or at least an equal state. Don't do them harm, right? Don't bring anything into their life with your interaction with them that is going to cause them any consternation or to get upset, as much as you can, as much as and Imam Shani said, I'd go out of my house every day and I would say to myself, I have sold my honor for Allah. So if people dishonor me, I'm not going to reciprocate or act upon that or anything like this. And if everyone acted like that, you'd have quite a different society. So in those situations, you don't have a lot of influence over. I think that's a good attitude to have. And the ones that you do, endeavor to find those circles and those people. I would say also like people who are sagacious and could be a mentorship role, and to benefit from their wisdom and for their companionship and how they conduct themselves. I think also is quite beneficial to people. So I would also recommend that as well.
Yeah. Okay. So we've been speaking about the company we keep, the people around us, and we've said that, sometimes you have a choice, sometimes you don't have a choice. We've spoken about the fact that there are some environments where you get triggered. Sometimes you have to feel like you have to conform. There are different relationships, how you manage those in the family and friends and so on. And also how our work surroundings sometimes can affect us in a positive and kind of a negative way. So, Dr. Waleed, was there a particular book that you'd like to recommend to the listeners at all?
Well, the one I've been talking about is called Etiquettes of Companionship by Imam Abdul Wahab al-Sha'rani, and it's been translated into English. If you look it up, it's called Etiquettes of Companionship. The book in Arabic is called Al-Anwar fi Adab al-Suhbah, being enlightened in the etiquettes of companionship. And there he kind of goes through the different types of relationships and friends and, things that we should be tolerant of, and how we go about acting in group settings or with individuals. And I think it's a beautiful work, a beautiful book. And it seemed like something that the author didn't just talk about, but lived. So he's kind of sharing his lived experience too. And he was quite famous for that because he has other books where he does talk about, he even describes the encounters he used to have and what he used to do and how people would speak to him and what he would do. And he has this book called, the gifts that I've received, the blessings that I have. And then he goes through some of those. And so I think, al-Kubra was Sughra, the major ones and the minor ones. So I think that book, which is available in English, I think would be a good read. Inshallah.
Okay, great,
How
great.
about yourself?
Yeah, I think I would the fiction I would recommend would probably be Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. And it's one of those books where there's a story about two sisters, one who has a high degree of decorum, restraint, and she doesn't get sort of provoked and triggered necessarily in situations. And the other one is highly sensitive to any comment and is really influenced by the people around her, and any kind of company that comes in, she goes off and running into that direction. She's very quick to comment rather than to be thoughtful, and it's really in many ways a discussion about how we behave in kind of in a social setting. And so it's a really interesting critique about that. And I think it's very relevant today because if you think about today, sensibility is about being able to show some restraint and show some decorum with regards your comments and your speech. And today, when you go into online communities and social media and so on, if people can get very aggressive, they can make really bad comments on the internet, which perhaps they wouldn't do in face to face. And those comments are digital evidences that will be there forever as long as it's stored in the cloud. It doesn't go away, right? Whereas before you could just say something to someone and they wouldn't necessarily pass it on, but now it's a digital imprint of what you said is there. So I think a book like Sense and Sensibility, reading that in the context of the human condition today, with regards people's ability to show some repose and restraint, rather than just saying whatever is in your mind, and I want to tell the whole world about it, and I want to kind of glorify my opinion and on a megaphone to the world. I think there's definitely some lessons in there for us as well. So that would be my my thought.
MashaAllah. Wonderful.
Yeah, yeah.
Sounds good.
Great. All right, Dr. Reed, always good to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Likewise.
And thank you most of all to all of our listeners. And until next time, peace be upon you.